Okay, welcome everyone. Here we are with another research chat. I'm welcoming back my good friend and colleague, Alex Channon from the University of Brighton. Alex, you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody. Yep, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me back.
Now, I've had Alex on this before and we've talked about study skills. And today we're going to take it in a slightly different angle, connected, more focused on research. The main target here is to talk about synthesis of theory. And what we'll do is we'll talk about it through the notions of deviancy. Now, just as a bit of context, me and Alex one of the first places we met, you'd probably have to confirm if it was the first place because you know how bad my memory is, but one of the first places we met was in 2005-2006 academic year at Loughborough in the third year doing Joe Maguire's deviancy module. So 2006 we took that, and I remember being in that class and building up to it, and I don't know about you, Alex, but I was quite excited to see Joe lecture and to hear Joe and see him kind of do his thing. But from there, we went and did a master's. When I started a PhD, I then taught that module with Joe for 4 years. So I've seen that module 5 years on the trot. While I was teaching it with Joe, I also taught in a college and taught a variation of it. And then when we first started teaching together, when we first started teaching, I think we both taught deviancy stuff. When I was at Brighton, I recreated the deviancy module in line with this. Alex now teaches it. So there's this thread of deviancy that goes throughout our career. Do you remember all that sort of stuff, Alex?
Yeah, like it was yesterday, mate. It was quite a module, that, and really happy to be keeping that alive. I've taught the same sort of areas of study, I guess, that we were learning in 2006. But obviously, you update it with newer examples and whatnot. But the core theoretical ideas have stayed pretty much the same, I think, and they're very useful for helping us understand sport and deviancy. So, it's a good fun thing to teach, actually. Students usually take to it quite well, the dark side of sports. Good times. Although you're wrong about when we first met, though. I'll just put a little corrective on there. It was the year before that. I remember it very clearly. I recommended Jay Coakley's book to you in the Student Union bookstore when you started at Loughborough.
Yes, because I came in at the second year and didn't have a clue what I was doing. As a mature student who didn't have the foggiest clue what I was doing at university. So thanks for that.
I think our relationship has stayed pretty much the same since then, hasn't it?
I'd like to say more or less, because it's got more than less. Yes, excellent. So in terms of deviancy in sport, while this is the examples that we'll use and some of the examples to bring the notion of theoretical synthesis to life in some respect, the reason I think we're doing this is because it's just been ingrained in our careers all the way through in terms of teaching it. Now, we have done some research that relies on some of these concepts and pulls them together in different ways. But I think mainly I teach this all the time. And the difference between teaching and writing a paper is that when we teach, we've got 12 to 24 weeks to talk through a broad lot of ideas, broad selection of concepts, different examples. One of the things that we expect from our students is to be able to, in some way, meaningfully bring those ideas together. And this topic, I think, works really well with that and lends itself to the different, taking ideas as a theoretical toolkit and putting them together. So I think that's kind of why we're using this as this example. So the first thing that we'll talk about, though, is disconnected from deviancy, but just the notion of synthesis in theory. Why we have to do it, why we have to bring theories together. And I'll just do a little bit of a language change on that because I don't like the word theory. I much prefer, especially in our area, academic ideas. So instead of synthesis of theory, why do we bring academic ideas together to help explain things?
When I'm teaching this, I think I start pretty much from in the spirit of the same point that you just made, really, that let's not call it theory, let's call it academic ideas. In so much as I think there's a tendency, depending on how you've learned sociology as an undergraduate or before, a tendency to sort of see theory in quite monolithic terms. That there's Marxist theory, and then there's Bourdieu's theories, there's feminist theory, there's symbolic interactionist theory, and see them in these quite discrete blocks. And if you're going to be a Marxist, then you're going to use Marxist concepts to think about something. If you're going to do feminism, then you're going to use feminist concepts. When we go out of that way of thinking about sociology and start to think less about the big abstract theorizations and the sociology as an academic discipline, and we start to apply it to real world situations where people behave in a number of different ways, and they do so, motivated by different forces, behaving in ways that might seem similar, but are actually quite different in terms of what drives them and what they end up doing in the end. Those sort of monolithic theories with their fairly static theoretical frameworks don't always work. They don't always lead us to the answers that we, the people who are involved in these things deserve. So if we want to understand the complex reality of why human actors do what they do, we need to have a broad range of ideas at our disposal to try and figure it out. And so that for me is where synthesis comes in, that we tend to learn theories isolated from one another, but there are elements of theories that might explain elements of people's behavior quite well. There are other elements of those theories that don't actually, and that might be misleading. They might actually end up leading us down the wrong path and making conclusions that are completely incorrect and unhelpful. So if we can take ideas from different theories, try and combine them in ways that are fruitful for explaining the situations we're encountering, then it's going to be better, in the end. So for me, theoretical synthesis is basically about having that, as you mentioned before, a toolkit where there are different theories in your toolkit, and sometimes you might use one element of one theory and one element of another to help make sense of a complex situation. I think context is the key here. What's the context of the situation that's unfolding that we're looking at, whether that's a question of athletes being violent off the field of play, whether it's to do with drug use, for instance, or corruption in national governing bodies. There are different ideas that we can take from various different theoretical traditions to help us explain several aspects of the overarching problem, whether that's the sort of big global processes involved, whether it's a small scale sort of cultural issue, any number of things that might be going on. If we've got lots of ideas and we can use those ideas fruitfully together, then we're going to get a more, what's the term that I think Joe Maguire used, reality congruent explanation, right? Yeah. An explanation that's more fitting with the reality of what's going on than otherwise.
Yeah, so it's the two-way intertwining of evidence and theory, making sure there's an alignment there. It's avoiding what I always call theoretical determinism, that here's my theory, I'm going to apply it to this data, and lo and behold, the data fits the theory. What a surprise. You've got no other way of thinking about the data. Of course, it's going to go that way. And a slightly kind of more pithy way of thinking about it is when people have pet theories. And I always think about the pet theory notion that it's like your dog. You look after this theory and you want it to do well, and you see it all the time, and you play with it and you nourish it and you care for it. But it's just a pet. It's just a pet. There's other pets, and all pets are equally good. So, but people have pet theories. I think the majority of our colleagues have a pet theory, and they may be better or worse at ignoring it and moving past it, but the majority do. I know that we've certainly discussed this, and we've probably been guilty in the past of overly focusing on certain theoretical positions, and I think we both try our hardest to try and read around that. And that's one of the things you have to do when you talk about this in terms of a toolkit. Is if you've only got a hammer in your hand, everything becomes a nail. Well, what you have to do then is have multiple different tools in your toolkit. And I guess for that, just as a note for anybody who's trying to kind of study using these ideas, students or postgrads or anyone who's trying to understand the world around them, to have that theoretical toolkit requires lots and lots of tools, which in this analogy is reading books, reading books, thinking about those different ideas and getting as many on board as possible. And then you can go, okay, this toolkit, this theoretical idea, this book does not work for this environment, but this one does, and I can apply that now. So this it's not a simple process. This we'll talk about it today in a quite kind of, just bring ideas together. But that's fine for us, because as I've already dated ourselves, we've been thinking like this since 2005, 2006. So we have a lot of these different things just to draw on and to pull on, and to use an example, if we're going to analyze sport and it's professional sport, we know that as soon as it's professional sport, there's usually money. So we'll bring some sort of an economic analysis into it, because we know that area and we can bring that in if we need to. And if it's not, we probably won't. So a simple idea like that, like you say, the context is so important. Now, one thing that I set up in a previous talk, which will probably be linked below, is the notion that when we look at complex problems, complex social issues, that we require complex explanations often. If we want to have a complex explanation, that usually leads to complex solutions, potentially. Now, that's a reality of dealing with these things that are historical, cultural, interpersonal, and a variety of different things. But me and you also talk a lot of the time about how we don't want complex theory. And when we come across complex theory used in a way which is dense, hard to understand, hard to interpret, lacks a simplicity to it, we push back against that. So how do we then work through this notion that me and you understand we're dealing with complex problems, but we don't want complex social theory? How do you make sense of that?
I always go back to the core purpose of using theory, and that is that it helps us to explain things. It should help us to understand the world. We can take measurements of, as you mentioned, data. We can do studies, we can gather that data, we can, try and get the most reliable, valid data that we can to explain any given problem. But we can't always see, everything. We can't measure everything. There's a bigger picture that's beyond our ability to measure. Theory is there to help us sort of see round corners, if you like. We take the data that we can get, and from that data, we extrapolate up an explanation that helps us to, to sort of explain, an explanation that explains, obviously, the bigger picture, what's driving this problem, what's responsible for this pattern of behavior that we see in, 5, 6 different studies. So we're using theory to add an explanation to something that we can't simply measure using our research methods. So because theory is part of the way that we go about explaining things, it needs to be useful, and it needs to help us to actually do that. If theory is written in a way that's so incredibly dense that you spend most of your time thinking about theory and not about the reality that theory is trying to help us explain, then you're just going to be getting lost in this sort of labyrinth, this rabbit warren of complex, overly complicated ideas. So yeah, the social world is complex. There are lots of things going on at once, lots of overlapping human actors that push in one direction, actors that push in another. There are structures that confine them. There are global forces that exist beyond their ability to comprehend. There are historical patterns that drive all these things as well. There's a lot of moving parts here, and reducing that all down to one big explanation, one big sort of meta-narrative, single story explanation, often obscures the complexity that's going on. So we need to try and sort of find a middle ground between really, really, really complicated theory that doesn't actually help us to explain any real things, and really reductive, simplistic theory that reduces that complexity down to just one element out of 10, let's say. So theory needs to be sort of custom crafted, I guess, to fit the situations that we're trying to explore. So yeah, overly complex theory, no. Theory should be useful at explaining complex situations in ways that help us to understand them. Obviously, sometimes that means that theory is going to be complicated. We can't get away from using jargon. It's there for for a reason, to help us to hold on to abstract conceptual ideas. But at the same time, we shouldn't fetishize that and make that the purpose. Let's come up with really incredibly dense theoretical explanations of things. No, let's try and understand the world and use theory to help us to do that. That for me is the core sort of reason behind using theory. So whenever we go to choose any particular concepts we're going to use for our research, that shape our research questions or help us to analyze our findings or whatever, I think it's really important that students, researchers, everybody who's involved in this sort of thing, keep centralizing that idea that theory should be there to help us to reach a better explanation of things, an explanation of things we can't necessarily measure directly, but an explanation that clarifies it nonetheless. So yeah, that's kind of my guiding principle with that.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the way that you outline that, in terms of having very, very complex language and theory that's trying to explain everything all in one little packet that generally doesn't work, versus a really reductive one idea, this is it, well, that doesn't work, as we term that necessary but insufficient as a part of the explanation. It's probably a key part, but on its own it doesn't do enough of about telling this wider story. So then the way I imagine this is, okay, it is a necessary part. What's the other necessary part? And what's the other necessary part? And can we get multiple necessary parts that on their own are relatively simple and bring them together, bringing together of academic ideas? And I think that's where I try and kind of move through this with that simple statement. And I've talked about this in that other video that I've already mentioned as a complex of ideas. Here's an idea, here's another, here's another, here's another. They're all joined together. That is a complex of ideas. It doesn't have to be complex. In fact, it shouldn't be complex. So as a kind of a broad point, let's now take this and try and put some flesh on the kind of structure that we've laid out in terms of deviancy and deviancy in sport. So first off, I think the use of the term is quite an interesting one. deviancy theory, you say something to somebody on the street, you're a deviant, they know what that means. There's a value judgment, as we'd call. It's a negative. It's not good to be called a deviant in most places. Now, we joke around it, but as a broad thing, if you're assigned by society as a deviant, that's a bad thing. But we don't really talk about that in that way in social science. We use the term as more of a descriptive sense. So what that would mean is to deviate from a norm, to not be in the kind of standard deviation of society. That's a very simplistic, reductionist way of thinking about it. But that's the first thing to get people to kind of, if they're not used to this, thinking about this area, is that we're not talking about anything usually using terms like good or bad. It's usually a measurement of behaviour. But as the first point of analysis, I start here with a very simple idea that social norms, things that are normal within a given social space, they're historical, they're cultural, they're social, and they are fundamentally important in how we can understand what is normal and therefore abnormal or deviant, what lies outside of that. So I think that's my start point. And I haven't linked that back to sport, but do you want to maybe link that into sports a little?
Yeah, I'll start with how I typically approach teaching on the deviancy module that we discussed earlier. Yes, completely agree. You know, this notion of deviant as a sort of descriptive label, does it fall within or without from, you know, some sort of normative judgment about what's anticipated or expected? So you either do what you're supposed to or you don't, and if you don't, then you're deviant. So that's kind of the sort of root of the term. But then there are two judgments going on here, and two things really that I want to explain using theory. One of them is if, you know, behavior X, let's say drug taking, if taking drugs in sport, doping, if that's considered deviant, which it is, then why do people do it? So what's the explanation for people engaging in acts which are labeled as deviant? On the flip side, the other thing is, which is a really interesting question, and this is one that most people don't, I think, spend a lot of time engaging with, why have we labeled that deviant in the first place? So what's the value judgment that has constructed this behavior as being abnormal and falling outside of the norms of you know, accepted behavior? So each issue that we're tackling here when we're looking at deviancy, we're kind of looking at it from two angles. One is the motivation to do it, if it's considered abnormal, and the other is, you know, why are we making that abnormal anyway? And this is why, you know, theoretical synthesis to explain doping is really useful, because, you know, think about the history of doping. We've got, you know, there's sort of anecdotal stories that get told every time we do these lectures about doping happening in the ancient Olympics, right? Athletes would take, you know, substances from, you know, from animals' adrenal glands, for instance, or, you know, other sort of animal supplements to give them a boost to their energy levels or whatever. We've got evidence from the early, I think, 1920s of newspaper reports on football matches in England where players were taking pep pills before the match to get them energy. And, you know, it's reported on in a way that's positive. You know, this is good preparation, right? These lads, they ate their breakfast and they had their pep pills. Excellent. So we know that we've had drugs being taken in sport for a long time, but it wasn't until around the 1960s that it became a problem and it was defined as deviant. And when we look at what international sport was doing in the 1960s, we're talking about the context of the Cold War, massive rivalry between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. So we've got a sort of global historical political issue there that helps to explain why we started to construct doping as deviant. There are other explanations, of course. I'm not going to go into all of them now. It would take forever. But we've got, you know, at least one thing there that we need to theorize using theoretical ideas that are not going to be the same as those that we would use to say, well, why do individual people take drugs? So the question of why is doping considered bad in sport historically and contemporarily, we need different theoretical ideas to answer that, because we're asking a big political question rather than the theories we would need to answer the question of why do people dope, where it's a much more sort of small scale and individual thing. We might still bring in those larger theories, those structural theories about perhaps economics of sport and political pressures on athletes to perform, etc. But at the individual level, that sort of micro level, what processes unfold that lead someone from, you know, I will never take drugs because I'm a true athlete, to, yeah, taking drugs is a normal part of my routine now. So yeah, we need different theoretical ideas to explain those different moments in the question of, you know, what makes, you know, doping a deviant behavior.
Yeah. And again, just to draw in on something that Joe said to us during those lectures that we talked about earlier, Joe Maguire, Who defines and by what criteria? So in terms of the deviancy acts, and Alex is laughing because I use this all the time, and I've used it ever since being taught by Joe. Who defines it and by what criterion? Who defines what is deviant and what isn't deviant, and what do they use to make that decision? Often tells us more, we would think, than the actual act of being called a deviant. Who's making the decisions? What power structures are they in? Why are they making those decisions? Tells us a lot than rather going, oh, I've taken drugs, therefore I'm a deviant. It's too simplistic.
And
But just in terms of that, yeah, go on. Yeah,
I mean, another really good example of that, who defines it by what criteria, is the question of fighting in ice hockey, where it's technically it's not within the rules. It's not a combat sport. You're not supposed to fight each other in ice hockey. But who defines that as being deviant or not? And you look at sort of fan reactions around the notion that fighting shouldn't be happening in ice hockey. I mean, you and I wrote a paper on this a while ago, didn't we, about how fans think about this. How do the athletes define the violence in ice hockey and its consequences for them? How do the fans define it? How do the governing bodies and the media companies? Generally, I think there's a broad sort of consensus that this is a good thing for the sport, even though in any other comparable sport, in field hockey, for instance, players coming to blows over a heavy body check would be completely illegal. And so it's, to understand this kind of what labels it as deviant behavior, that question is really important. Who defines it and by what criteria? And also sort of running over that, why are they making that judgment? There's a political economic motivation there, I think. Certainly when it comes to the entertainment value of and the spectacle of players punching each other on the ice, there's something overriding that. So there's so many different issues going on here, and we need to have theoretical ideas that help us to explain those at different levels.
Yeah, and the economic imperative for that one, I think, is probably the main explanation over the long term. But just to move in, and you kind of mentioned what, in different moments of understanding these questions, I think if we move from that broad overarching perspective, historical, cultural, we can move into something that's maybe more group interactional based. And I think one of the ways into that is the notion of what is and isn't deviant has a moralistic dimension. And within those groups and our interactions with each other is how those morals play out. And again, I'm using the term moral here, not in a kind of, oh, you're so moralistic, that's so good, as a descriptive way that people assign values and meanings to things. And in this respect, I think we can bring in two ideas. One is stigma, which is a very, very well-developed theoretical idea within criminology, deviance theory, and sociology more broadly. But also the opposite of stigma, basic rewards. That within groups, if we have these wide cultural ideas, these historical ideas, and I conform to them, I'll often get rewarded for it. If I subvert them, challenge them, reject them, I may be stigmatized. So I think that's the kind of next level of analysis that I like to work through, is now into some sort of interactional group way that this works out. And this is actually going back to our paper on ice hockey, which I'll put in the notes for this. I think that's where this operates. We talk to fans who were explaining what is and isn't okay in violence, and how this is mainly okay, and how they make sense of it. And it's an interaction thing with the players and each other. Where do you fit with those sort of ideas around the interactions between people in this as a theoretical kind of contributor to explaining it?
Well, I'll go for that one too. One of the first studies that I did, for my PhD, the study of mixed sex martial arts practice, so men and women practicing martial arts together, and the question of hitting. Do you hit girls? To the question to the men that I interviewed, and the women that I interviewed as well. What happens when men are supposed to hit you as part of training? Because obviously there's, in our society at large, there is a very sort of strong moral condemnation against men that hit women. And rightly so for many historically grounded reasons. It's pretty clear that there's a strong problem of violence against women, and that we need to take a stand against this. It's not okay for men to hit women. Largely men sort of construct their sense of masculinity around this. It's important to be, as a man, it's important to be strong, it's important to be, emotionally tough, and so on and so on. And it's important to be respectful to women. That's a pretty sort of generic element, I think, of many men's ideas about their own masculinity. Likewise, if we were to use let's say a generic feminist perspective, men hitting women is an expression of sort of patriarchal violence. And that's something that should be it's something that's abhorrent, and it's something that should be campaigned against, and it is campaigned against, etc., etc. So there's a large sort of, and several ways we can explain the backdrop here, this large resistance to men hitting women. In a martial arts gym, particularly if we're talking about combat sports athletes who need to get hit to get good at their sport, they need to train under pressure. They need to know how to take a punch. They need to know how to, evade and counter and so on and so on. If you're not genuinely trying to hit your opponent, then the training that you're doing with them isn't particularly good. It's not very beneficial for them. And quite often in the study that I conducted, this was a few years ago now, about 10 years ago, there were not many women in the gyms that I went to. And I think that's probably still the case, actually, in most sort of competitive level martial arts. Usually you'll get more men in a gym than you will women. And that usually means that there won't be that many sparring partners for women at any given weight category. There's just fewer of them. So quite often, if you're a female competitor, you have to spar with men. That's a reality for many female martial artists. So for this person to get better at martial arts, they need the man to hit them. And in that small group environment, the norm there is, well, if you're a martial artist, if you're an athlete, then you should be treated the same as anybody else. And that's generally the case among competitive martial artists, that gender shouldn't be the primary sort of guiding principle that sort of sits over our interactions with one another. And that can be a very disconcerting thing for men, particularly, to have to try and grapple with this idea that actually it's not that hitting a girl isn't wrong. It's actually that hitting a girl is what you're supposed to do. And I say girl, this is the language that was often used in these contexts, girl, woman.
Yeah.
So I should hit this person as part of their development as an athlete, but kind of squaring that away against the tensions that come through from hitting women is wrong, provided really interesting fodder for a study. So at the interactional level, in that small space, you get these kind of awkward negotiations where men initially, they might hold back a fair bit, or they might have to sort of explicitly ask, is it okay if I hit you? Or they apologize after every hit that lands. Alternatively, they when their female partners start to work them around a little bit and land a few shots, they get a little bit insecure that they're being beaten by a woman, so they then go in too hard and hit too much, because again, gender is sneaked back in as an organizing principle. So either way, there's a kind of deviance going on for those guys who can't get past you shouldn't hit women. They're not throwing anything into these encounters, and that violates the norms of that space, that you're supposed to treat each other as equals. Ultimately, it's quite frustrating and not very productive for the women involved. If we then bring back in that feminist perspective that I mentioned earlier, this idea that there's a sort of patriarchal violence going on, well, for the women involved in combat sports, actually becoming a competent fighter and experiencing their bodies as strong and powerful, particularly in moments where they sparred with men, could be quite they use the word empowering, right? It's quite a common term to see used in these kind of contexts. So not being able to have that experience actually deprived them of something that was empowering, and something that could shatter myths about female frailty, and that contributes to the logic of patriarchy, etc., etc. So I feel like I'm going around this the long way, but ultimately, from a feminist perspective, there is a value to women being hit by men in that context. If it makes them better martial artists, they feel empowered, and we can all sort of challenge these myths about female frailty. So the potential for deviance sort of swings both ways in this context, that you might feel that actually there's a bigger imperative to not hit women that I shouldn't violate, but in this space, that means violating another imperative, which is to treat everyone as an equal martial artist. So looking at the sort of small scale interactions as people struggle with those competing sort of values and ideals was really interesting as a sociologist, and it needs to bring in lots of different theoretical concepts to help explain why people behave as they do in this particular environment. Sorry if I've meandered a little bit there. I got caught up in the research, but I think that's...
I think just to kind of pull that through back into a kind of a theoretical idea, which is fundamental to what you're talking about, is subcultural theory. Within that space that you were in, let's call it a subculture for now, there was a different set of norms which people had to learn from a previous subculture, the world, which is not really a subculture, is it? The Western world that the boys grew up in. The way that this kind of played out for me in one of the gyms that I trained at was, and you'll have heard this story a million times, gear versus gear. That when I trained in the gym, with people, gear was referred to as steroids, and people would happily discuss their gear use. When I went and socialized at the same time period of my life, what people termed as gear was cocaine. Both drugs, both can cause physical harm, both can be understood as deviant, but both groups were happy to talk about their use of gear. And then you speak to the other groups about gear, and they each said, oh, I'd never do that, I'd never do that. So the recreational drug users would never do steroids because that's so bad, and the steroid users would never use recreational drug use because that's so bad. It just shows the kind of, unless you decouple deviancy from a value judgment, it makes no sense, because what is everyone bad then? It doesn't make any sense. And what you've just talked us through there is this notion of being in different spaces. Different cultural norms become normalized through those interactions, these interpersonal kind of games that people play. So I think that's to kind of move from that wider issues we've talked about now into these interactions where the subcultures come in, the groups. A key idea that we've not mentioned, which is something that for any of our students that are listening to this would be sports nets. Nixon's work from the early 90s. It's a very good way in which these ideas get played out and normalized through into different groups. So Nixon's work. And then I think the final level of analysis that I tend to go to, and we've missed bits, and there's always, we're reducing it in some respects, but to try and have some sort of organized system for this attempts at bringing ideas together, is the personal, the experiential, how that individual person interprets that social norm and interprets that interaction with that person, and maybe challenges it and says, no, I'm not going to be like that. And the example that I use in my other video is mostly men have short hair. And it takes something somewhere along the line for a chap to say, no, I'm going to work at this. I'm going to grow my hair out for a while. At some point, there's a choice been made, or maybe lots of choices, not to shave it off. So we have to bring this in, because if we don't bring this in as sociologists, we're left with these big social ideas and these more meso-social ideas, these networks and groups, making people do things rather than maintaining the focus on the individual as a unit of analysis, that an individual is a thinking being. Might not be completely free thinking, but there's choices to be made. So how do we factor in this kind of individual choice or individual challenge to these deviants or normal ideas?
So I think that's a really good question, and it sort of nicely kind of leads to where I always sort of end up with thinking about theory is there are, in all sociological theories, all social theories, there will be similar themes that come through. There'll be something that theory A or theory B says about power. There'll be something that theory A, theory B says about individual free will and so on. And for me, thinking about power and free will and what you mentioned, the individual choice, is this dichotomy between agency and structure. And again, if anyone's a sociology undergraduate, you probably would have had this, I hope you would have had this fairly early in your studies. If you're not a sociologist, then this is a really useful sort of couple of concepts to be thinking with about any kind of social theory and any any sort of social problem. So agency and structure, to what extent does a person have freedom to sort of make their own mind up and act on their decisions, right? That's agency. How free am I to execute my own will? And then on the other hand, there's structure. So what kind of things constrain me and prevent me from making my own free decisions and then acting them out as I choose? And I think in all theories that we're looking at, there is sort of maybe more or less perspective on the agency or the structure side of the question, but there will always be some attempt to address that. So in the big structural theories that I mentioned feminism a couple of times. We've talked about commercial imperatives as kind of an economic deterministic theory like Marxist theory usually veers towards answering questions about structure. There's long-running cultural norms that indoctrinate people into a way of behaving that reproduces patriarchy, or there's big economic forces that place huge limitations on the lives of most people and constrain them into a life of wage labor or whatever. So those are the structural side of things. But then when we start thinking about agency, as you say, people do have brains. They are competent, rational thinkers, most of them, and they will make decisions. And sometimes the decisions are simply to go with the flow. It's easier just to go along with those cultural norms that we're surrounded by. Sometimes they won't even recognize that they're going with the flow. It will seem natural to them. Like you mentioned with the norms of masculinity, having short hair for men, it just, oh, I'm due a haircut. It's because my hair's getting long. And you don't think about that as something that you're sort of being trained to do by your culture. You just go ahead and do it. But sometimes people actively resist those norms, and they make decisions to stand up and to, say resist and go against the flow. So we can't really understand human behavior if we give no credence to agency. So theories like symbolic interactionism place a larger emphasis on agency. And those other theories do as well. There's obviously this agency within feminist perspectives. How will we ever change anything if people weren't willing to stand up and fight for equality and so on? So yeah, whenever we're thinking about what theories we're going to use, whether we're talking about sport deviancy or literally anything, that question of how much freedom do people have and what are the forces that constrain their freedom is, it's a pretty important one for all theories to try and answer. Where we come unstuck with using just one theory is we've got only really, any given theory might only give us sort of one dimension and only really look at the structural issues and not give us the time of day to, conceptually figure out how people make their decisions and how they act on them. So that's where we've, in our research work, we've tried to bring in symbolic interactionist concepts. We've used concepts from Elias's theories and from Bourdieu's theories, alongside the more structural stuff that we're also using to sort of bridge that gap and try and answer those dual questions. How do people do what they want to, and in what conditions do they do it?
Yeah, and it kind of just highlights, doesn't it, the importance of these different levels of analysis, which without bringing those different ideas together, you simply can't explain most things sufficiently well, and unless you choose to suggest, okay, I'm going to explain this through this one idea, and that's the limitation of it. And if you want to do that, we'll fair play. There's always going to be reasons for doing something like that. But this, I think, more and more, I think when I look back at our work and my work, it's probably in these latter two sections that most of our data collection and analysis has operated, with that first broader idea over the top, almost as a context, which I always encourage my students to go and read the literature reviews in a lot of my papers, mainly for that literature, because it's the context, the big ideas that are outlined there. And then the data comes through, because we do a lot of kind of interviews and hanging around with people and interviewing and watching and observing. It's hard to see big cultural ideas from those little interactions. So I think that's where a lot of our work fits. Just to kind of just start pulling some of these ideas together, I think I've mentioned a few papers along the way. I've mentioned ours. I'll put that in the description. Howard Becker is the person to go to for this, if anybody is looking at this in terms of deviancy. Not only because his early work was specifically about deviancy, so The Outsiders, but also his more recent books on evidence, and the other one it's down there, I can see it, but I've not got my glasses on, so I can't read it. His more latest one on evidence, just literally typed, called Evidence, talks about the importance of bringing different ideas together and how we relate that to data. So I think that Howard Becker is a person to go to. In terms of deviancy in sport, where do we send people to go to if they want to read that? Because we've mentioned some ideas, but we've not really given too many papers. Where do you start, Alex?
That is a tricky one. There are a few textbooks that I still kind of make use of occasionally, but they're a little bit dated now. One is Mike Atkinson and Kevin Young's Deviance and Social Control in Sport. The other would be Sport Matters, Eric Dunning. Fairly old stuff, but in terms of theoretical explanations of the fundamentals of deviancy theory, both pretty useful. Besides that, when I'm teaching this stuff, I usually would use a bespoke reading list every week with relatively recent journal articles on whatever topic we're referring to. So if you like, I can send you a couple of examples of that to tag onto the reading list for this episode.
Yeah, for sure. And The Sports Ethic by Hughes and Coakley, which as much as deviancy theory has ran throughout our careers, that paper has certainly ran throughout my career. It's a paper that I assign at every single level of any bit of teaching that I ever do, because the first years read it and they can get it. The third years read it and they get it much better, and they still need to keep reading it. It's just a great way for students to grasp some of these ideas that we talked about in a way which is, I like the simplicity of the paper. It talks about some big ideas. It is grounded in a simple language for actually quite complicated ideas, and it actually encapsulates quite a lot of what we've talked about today in terms of that reduction of jargon where possible, reduction of over complexity where possible, and looking for simplicity in analysis. It has an elegance to it, that paper, I think.
I was rather hoping that we would get through this without mentioning the sports ethic, because like you, I do use it quite often. But yeah, you're right. It's a very useful idea, one that certainly appears in my teaching. So yeah. One too.
And then just a note for I mean, there'll be a variety of different people watch this, but specifically for the undergraduates and for master students and maybe PhD students who are writing literature reviews. The way that we've picked through this analysis, the general. So the overarching into more specific ideas, into the interpersonal, is a great way that you can set up essays and literature reviews, from the general to the specific. It's a great way to do an analysis. I guess it's a heuristic device that you can just use to throw at a thing, an idea, and see if that way of explaining it works, and it often does. And then more broadly, away from the kind of studying things in a kind of formal sense, if people want to explain stuff, whatever that stuff is, why this happens at work or why that happens, you apply this level of analysis to that as well. It just is a useful way to understand the world around us. It stops us focusing on one explanation. It makes us try and integrate different ideas in a way which is simplistic and can be understood. I'll make a link to the video where I talk about that as well, at the bottom. Have you got anything to add, Alex, before we wrap it up?
No, I think that's a fairly neat summary. There are, when we're talking about deviancy or any other complicated human behavior, there are multiple things that we need to understand. I would just sort of end my input here by reiterating that question about deviancy in particular. It's not just important to figure out why people do things wrong, and how can we prevent them from wrongdoing, or help them to make better decisions, etc., etc. But also thinking critically about why we think that certain things are wrong. And there's a lot of questions to be answering there. And in the sports world, some things that we think of as really black and white, right and wrong, actually, we can problematize that, and using different theoretical ideas will help us to do so. So, yeah, hopefully this has been useful in studying sport deviancy.
Yeah, there's a cracking example from a conversation I had with Paul Dimio where he will be in a situation where you talk through the logic or lack of logic there is within drug anti-doping. Talk through it, everyone nods and agrees, yes, the research, yes, the logic, we agree. And then they get to it and say, but are you for or against drugs? Reduces an hour of research and logic into a moralistic yes, no, maybe. And with a yes being bad, you can't be for drugs, that's bad, you're not moral. And the reduction of that stuff is it's the antithesis of critical thinking. And I guess what we're talking about is a systematic framework for critical thinking that avoids value judgment, emotion, as much as possible anyway. Okay, let's finish there. That was good. Thanks very much for your time, Alex. Really appreciate it. I'm sure we'll do another one of these sooner rather than later. We'll come up with some new ideas and we'll see everyone then. Okay, cheers.